Well, we want to welcome you again to another one of our Determined Truth live streams. Today, we're going to be exploring the questions, what does the Bible say about land, wealth, and justice? And how should we understand this in light of the message of Jesus and the gospel of the kingdom? Now, we're going to examine these questions by looking at the story of Archbishop Óscar Romero and his work in El Salvador. Bishop Romero insisted that justice for the people of El Salvador, especially the landless peasants, was not a political agenda, but a gospel imperative. For Romero, the scriptures made it clear God stands with the oppressed, and the church must do the same. But, as to be expected, his vision of justice was faced with fierce resistance. The Salvadorian government, backed by military forces, which were often supported by the United States funding and foreign policy, itself, I think, often motivated by U.S. corporate interests, waged a brutal campaign against Romero and those demanding equity. Peasants who organized themselves for land reform were labeled as communists and silenced, often violently. And so this conversation today is going to invite us to consider how the scriptures address economic injustices, and then to reflect on the church's role in confronting such policies, both foreign and domestic, that cause suffering in the name of stability or profit. To have this conversation, we're going to have one of the world's leading experts on Óscar Romero and El Salvador and the role of the church. But let me begin by welcoming my colleague, Danny Hall. Danny, welcome.
Good to be here.
Thank you. So today, Danny and I are excited to be joined by Professor Matthew Whelan. Matthew's a scholar, has written a powerful book on Óscar Romero. I put up here in the top corner there. Matthew is a Catholic theologian and a moral theologian and scholar whose work explores the intersections of theology, justice, and social transformation. He holds a PhD in theology from Duke University. Probably, Danny, because he couldn't get into my alma mater at Cal State Hayward, but that's okay. So he's the author of Blood in the Fields, Óscar Romero, Catholic Social Teaching and Land Reform at the University of Notre Dame Press. It's a groundbreaking study that highlights Archbishop Romero's deeply Christ-centered and scriptural approach to justice, particularly in relation to agrarian reform and the dignity of the poor. Dr. Whelan, as of July 1, formerly of Baylor University, but soon to be a professor at Duke Divinity School, his research, as I said, focuses on Catholic theology, social thought, liberation theology, political theology, and theological dimensions of land and labor. He's written on ecological ethics and the church's role in resisting and dehumanizing economic systems. So let's begin by saying welcome. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us today.
Thank you, Rob and Danny. I appreciate it. Appreciate the invitation to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. You know, a couple of things as we begin here. First of all, a lot of our listeners may not even know who Óscar Romero was. Yeah. So maybe a quick bio on him. And he's often misunderstood as a political figure, but you make it clear that he was first and foremost a man rooted in Christ. So give us a little bit of a background on who he was, and then particularly how his faith, is where he was grounded, not just politics, but his following of Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. So briefly about Romero, he was born in 1917 in Ciudad Barrios, in a small town in El Salvador, and lived most of his life in El Salvador, was educated there as well as in Rome. But if you know anything about him, you know that he was made in 1977 the Archbishop of San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador. And he rose to fame, international recognition for speaking out against injustice and violence during that time, which was just prior to the Salvadoran Civil War from 1980 to 1992. For instance, he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, and he was assassinated on March 24th, 1980 by a sniper. He was the first archbishop murdered at the altar since Thomas Becket in the 12th century.
Wow.
So, there's a lot to say about him. If you know anything about him, also you'll know probably he's oftentimes described as undergoing a dramatic conversion, kind of like Paul on the Damascus Road, a transformation from being sort of conservative retrograde to progressive fighter for social justice. I think it's more complicated than that, but that's the story oftentimes told about him. But Christ was absolutely at the center of everything he was about. I think it was Dorothy Day, who's an important Catholic theologian of the 20th century, who said something to the effect of, I would like to live in a way that my life is unintelligible if Christ didn't exist. That's how I think about Romero. Christ was absolutely at the center of his thinking, in his life, his sermons. I mean, most of his theological output was sermons, and they're constantly circling around Christ and the Gospels, the Beatitudes, the Passion. And that's the lens through which he really understands everything. Also, just the incarnation itself is like a guiding principle of his thinking. The incarnation means that God entered history at a particular point in time, right? But it also means for him that Christ continues to be present in history, not abstractly, but really present. And one of the places that Christ is especially present for Romero is in the poor. And he thinks that because of his reading of Matthew 25:31-46, where Jesus says,
Right.
you know, I was hungry and you gave me food, etc., that Christ continues to be present in history, especially in those in need. And Christ calls to followers of Christ to incarnate the gospel, to follow Christ into the world, and especially where Christ is found in the world. And I think that, like, just one thing that's also just really important to stress about, like, how it was that Christ sort of is at the center of Romero is with respect to his martyrdom. You know, he knew he was facing death threats, and he had the option to flee. He had the option for protection, but it was because of the way he thought about Christ and how Christ didn't flee. Christ required him to sort of follow in the footsteps of Christ, that he was willing to embrace suffering and death out of love for his friends, just like Christ did. So really, Christ is absolutely at the heart of what he's about. I mean, that said, like, the gospel has political implications, he thought, but like, Christ was at the heart of it, and those implications were secondary or tertiary.
Can you help us a little bit by setting maybe a little bit more of the context of what was happening in El Salvador socially, politically? You know, we talk about the poor and the poverty, but there was an important climate that was happening back then that sets the context for him. And then how he has this preferential treatment of the poor. You've already touched on that, but maybe some ways that began to play out in his ministry that ultimately gets him in some trouble.
Yeah. So basically what was happening in El Salvador, like much of Latin America over the course of the 19th, 20th century, I'm simplifying a very complicated story, but you have a gradual dispossession of people that once depended upon access to land to farm for their livelihoods. This story is different in different countries, but in El Salvador, what begins to happen in the late 19th century is there's a sort of a privatization movement where the government, the legislative assembly, essentially privatizes land that was once held communally and through complex land tenure arrangements that were customary. So to make a long, complicated story short, what begins to happen over the course of the 20th century is that, among other reasons, because of the interests of prominent Salvadorans and others in land to farm coffee and sugarcane and cattle and cotton and other crops for export, those crops expand in this very small country at the expense of people that once had access to land and farmed that land to make ends meet, right? So what do those people do? Well, they have to move. They have to migrate, right? And they migrate from lands that they previously owned or had access to and controlled and farmed to other lands, to marginal lands, hillsides, which are not good for agriculture. They migrated regionally within Central America. They migrated to places like Honduras. And then they also migrated internally to El Salvador following the harvests, right, as migratory or seasonal labor. And so what was happening when Romero became Archbishop is this situation was just increasingly acute. People didn't have access to land. They didn't have a way to earn their livelihood, to farm in any kind of way. And when they tried to reform, when they tried to advocate for reform, the response of the government was repression, right? And so that then created a situation that grew increasingly sort of intense and escalated towards civil war. So that's sort of the background that Romero inherits. There's more going on, but that's in broad brushstrokes what's happening. And then can you just remind me, the second part of your question was about sort of the Gospels, how that shaped Romero's response to the situation?
Yeah. I actually, so people like me that are slow of understanding, sometimes my ADD kind of distracts. So let me see if I can summarize that first. So the second part of the question was, how was his preferential treatment for the poor, and how was that influencing what he was doing? But
Yeah.
let me see if I can kind of restate what you said to make sure that I'm tracking well. And that is that you have people owning this common land that communally owned, and now it's being privatized out for, I'm assuming, for the sense of, um, can I say, a capitalist endeavor to expand the productivity, therefore to increase trade and the state's well-being. But that happens, you said, at the expense of the poor. How's that happening at the expense of the poor? Can you clarify that part for me? I think that's an important context for myself, at least. And then how was Romero's responding to this?
Yeah, so basically, one of the ways it was happening at the expense of the poor is that land that people formerly had access to through customary arrangements, like not
Okay.
formal arrangements,
Right.
like not a deed to their property, but just like my father and his father and their mother
Okay.
in sort of on back, they're the ones that farm this land. That's how I know that this is my land, because we've
Okay.
always farmed land, right? So essentially what happens is the state says that form of land tenure is no longer valid. Now you need to have a title, right? And this process favored those with money, those with lawyers or
Who
access
could
to
get the
lawyers,
titles?
Yeah.
who could get the titles. And so what you
Okay.
begin to have is a market in land in a way that didn't exist before. And those that benefited from that market in land were wealthier people. Again, this is really complex. And if your
Yeah.
their listeners want more about this, I can suggest some reading for them. But
Okay.
that's
Good.
what happens. Yes.
Okay. So how does this influence then Romero's activities in terms of his preferential treatment for the poor? What kind of things was he advocating for? Just, hey, let's just go back to what we had before, or probably more complex than that?
It was more complex than that. So, I mean, first off, just at the heart of Romero's thinking, are texts like his preferential option for the poor. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
texts like,
Please.
Luke 18 through 19, right? Where Jesus talks about his mission in Luke's gospel is to bring good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free, so on and so forth. I've already mentioned like Matthew 25, 31 to 46, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me, right? Like these are sort of at the heart of how Romero is already interpreting this reality. But like what's really important about this reality is the agricultural face of it, right? Like these are issues, poverty, and the kind of words we're talking about with respect to Jesus. These are filtered, or he sees the social reality that I've just been describing through the lens of text, scriptural texts like this, right? And so he's really concerned about the way that access to land is such a problem within El Salvador, and how the wealthy are sort of hoarding that land, right? And not for producing food to benefit Salvadorans, but rather for export production, capitalist production, which is about sort of profit, about sort of crops that are being produced that are consumed elsewhere in Europe and the United States, right? This is the problem, right? So one of the things he begins to do, and he's not alone, he's following many others, right?
Right.
Is he begins to advocate for land reform, right? And what that essentially means is he's trying to work with different groups at the time that are struggling to ensure that ordinary Salvadorans have access to land to farm. So he's really interested in social debates about how much farmland is too much land. Like, is 500, hectares enough land for a family? Maybe we should cap it at that, so that the excess land in the country could, through sort of remuneration of landowners and sort of redistribution, sort of enable sort of campesino or peasant farmers to farm.
Wow. Okay.
He's involved in these kinds of debates about how it is that we can help support the livelihood of ordinary poor Salvadorans, primarily through access to land, if that makes sense. And what, the reason why he's doing this is because he believes that God gives creation as a common gift, and it's a matter of justice that all people have access to it, right? So
let me have some verse again for clarifying the context. Talk a minute about what the government of El Salvador was like at that, who was in power, and how much of this export business is tied to multinational corporations, particularly American corporations. Like if all the stuff is being exported, is it merely benefiting the wealthy in El Salvador, or they have ties to multinational corporations that are also bringing outside influence to the political economic situation there?
Great question. Yeah. So the government at the time was a military dictatorship.
Okay.
It had been since 1932. There's a long history of unbroken military rule in El Salvador following an event Salvadorans called La Matanza, the massacre, the killing, which happened in 1932, where there was an uprising in the western part of El Salvador, and General Martinez sort of marched in with his troops and then just massacred people. Estimates are as much between like 10,000, 30,000. We don't know, but many, many, many people died. And the military controlled El Salvador from that point onward. So who is benefiting? Well, in El Salvador, unlike other parts of Latin America, there weren't huge U.S. corporate interests. Like lots of places in Central America are known as banana republics, primarily because of the influence of the banana. But El Salvador doesn't have that presence in the same kind of way. So these are mostly wealthy Salvadoran elite families. They're known sort of colloquially as las 14 familias, the 14 families. There's more than 14, but that gives you sort of like an image of the concentration of wealth. Many of them are sort of German immigrants that sort of settled and became naturalized Salvadoran citizens, as well as others. The current president of El Salvador, for instance, has lineage from Palestine. Or Lebanon, excuse me, Lebanon. So in any case, there are sort of European and other sort of influence migrants that come, but there's primarily the beneficiaries are Salvadoran families at the time.
Wow. Okay. And now you can feel free to speak more about this if you like, but this is, we're putting this as part of the Revelation Revealed series. And what I'm doing in this series over the course of time is to simply say, I think we've lost sight of Jesus in the gospel, and that Jesus in the gospel and his concern for the poor. And that we've embraced what I think the book of Revelation describes as the harlot Babylon, which is wealth and prosperity and power in the Roman Empire, which benefited only the elite. And all this is the way the beast and the way empire works, undermining the kingdom of God and God's people. So it sounds very much that it fits exactly what you're talking about with Óscar Romero. And so I've touched on this. I wrote 2 blogs a couple weeks ago on the poor in light of the big, beautiful bill act that Congress is now evaluating, which is substantially cutting aid for the poor and the marginalized and the elderly and Medicare, and of course reducing taxes for the wealthy. And I think, well, I don't care what your politics are, but I think Jesus would not be happy with this. And I used an example of the widow's mite. So this sounds like a lot of what Óscar Romero was getting at. If you want to flesh that a little bit more, go ahead and feel free to do that.
No, I mean, I think that sounds a compelling interpretation to me. I mean, I think if he were alive today, he'd be very concerned about our some political developments, the big, beautiful bill, migration, many other things.
Yeah.
So I think you're exactly right. And I think that he never used the language of empire to describe the United States, but many others have thought about the U.S.'s history of involvement in Latin America as a kind of empire.
Yeah. And we hope to have more conversations with that as well. So Danny, go ahead.
Yeah, I just say one of the out of this then is, and maybe we can pause here to unpack one concept, and that's he was often labeled as a liberation theologian, and of course, in some circles that's a real trigger word or trigger title that and often misunderstood. And there's, I mean, it's a multifaceted movement. Can you just maybe talk a little bit about your understanding of liberation theology, particularly Latin American liberation theology, how he fits into that, would you use that label of him? And if so, how, in what way would you mean it by that, using that label of him?
Yeah, Danny, that's a great question, an important one, a complicated one. Can I ask you a question about that first? Like, why do you
Sure.
think that liberation theology, can you just give me sort of a quick sense of like why it's such a trigger word, why it's such a problem?
Mm.
Is it the perceived influence of Marxism upon it, or is it
Yes,
something else?
it's my first encounter with it was in the 70s myself, when I was a sort of a young Bible and theology student myself. Began to it was caricatured to among the people that I was reading and listening to at that point in the 70s as being one tied to Marxism too much. It was a product of, I grew up in the theologically still in the stream where the social gospel versus the real gospel debates were taking place within the American evangelical church. It was assumed by many people on the evangelical side of the equation that more liberal Protestant theology had abandoned, quote, the gospel of the deity of Christ, salvation, all those kinds of things that we associated traditionally. And in its place, they had elevated the idea of social justice. And so that became the new focus. So it was a bifurcation of those two ideas.
Yeah.
And very prominent. So liberation theology and this would be attached to that idea, that this idea of social justice is replacing or superseding in that view, the true understanding of the gospel of Jesus dying for our sins and that part of it. And so that's kind of the roots of where that came from. So that's why I think it was tainted for so many people in my generation, particularly during that era, because it was part of that struggle between what is the gospel and it was a vestige of the fundamentalist modernist debates of the early 19th century, late 19th, early 20th centuries. And so that's kind of where I first encountered it, and why it was for many people became sort of this code word for liberal. Then it got attached politically to Marxism, because of that balance of power thing between the United States and Cuba, and the Cuban and Soviet influence in Central America. So all these things, both political and theological history, sort of merged into this negative idea of what liberation theology was about. Yeah.
So the concern that you or the people that you're speaking about have about liberation theology, that's not Romero. If that's what liberation theology is, he's not that.
Okay. Oh, interesting. What is he then?
Yeah, he's very critical of Marxist thought. Well, I think he thinks of himself arguably as a kind of liberation theologian, but I think he thinks that there are diverse currents or streams of liberation theology. So rather than a single thing, like a monolith, he thinks of liberation theology more like a river with like different stream or currents within it that are cross-cutting, that are sometimes disagreeing with one another about the meaning of liberation, who its primary agents are, what its goal is ultimately and proximately, right? So it's just, I think he thinks of himself as part of a complex debate. I mean, he talks about liberation all the time, but he sees it largely as synonymous with salvation, describing God's work in Christ and in the Holy Spirit and what it does in our lives. It liberates us from sin and death. And that makes a whole new way of life possible for human beings, among other ways, because we're no longer afraid of death in the same way we would be otherwise, right? It leads to a sort of a radical way of loving God and neighbor that makes those who embrace it or who are embraced by it, right, capable of laying down their lives in love, right? So instead of speaking about liberation theology, he often speaks about that the gospel makes liberators, right? Christian liberators. So sort of people whose lives have been transformed by the gospel and by salvation in Christ, who are able to live in ways like Christ. So his dear friend, Rutilio Grande, was a Jesuit priest who was a close friend of his and worked in Aguilares, which was close to where Romero was in San Salvador. Rutilio Grande was killed, shot and
Right.
killed for living in this way, right? And so for Romero, his first homily, his first sermon as archbishop was about Rutilio Grande as a Christian liberator. So anyway, getting back to the question of liberation theology, if you assume that it's like a diverse, complex movement with different currents, with different stances, like certainly there were people in Latin America at the time that were Marxists and that were
Right.
thinking about liberation in terms of Marxist class analysis, sort of, class conflict in that kind of way, right? But Romero was very critical of those people, but yet he thought of himself as advocating for liberation, right?
So
Excellent.
what would Romero's view about private land ownership? I know I talked about these customarily controlled lands being privatized and the wealthy get a hold of them, but it might be easy to think of that as he's against private land ownership, which is always, and could you clarify that a little bit? And his views on that, and then because that's where he starts to sound. Some people will try to interpret him as being more Marxist in that regard. If there is no private land ownership, et cetera, and how do we think through that particular part of it?
Yeah, so he's not against private land ownership. So this is so he's dependent upon a tradition of thinking commonly known as Catholic social teaching. And Catholic social teaching characteristically critiques both communism and capitalism. It tries to sort of think about property in such a way that's neither capitalist, neither communist, right? So,
Okay.
but theologically, he's grounded in the idea that God once again gives creation as a gift that's meant to benefit all
Right.
people, not just the privileged few. And so his primary concern is inequality and injustice in distribution of land, not ownership per se. He
Okay.
doesn't oppose private ownership. What he opposes is unjust ownership, like a small elite controlling vast tracts of land while so many people don't have access to it, and land, they're dependent upon land for their livelihood. So,
Right.
so I mean, the Catholic social teaching tradition talks about private ownership as in various ways. It talks about land or property as having a social function or having a social mortgage. And what they mean by that is that we, as those of us that own land, own property, right, we need to think about it on this way of thinking as not just about benefiting us, our family, our kin, but God gives us what we have been given
Yeah.
to share with others, to benefit others through our lives, through the management of what we have. And so concretely, what that looks like is if you're like a large landowner in El Salvador, and this is what people like Romero argued, you should be thinking about how much you need and how much you don't. How much land is enough? And once you have enough, like you should be sharing with others. Moreover, anyone that works on your land, you should be paying just wages, so much so that they might be able to own land and property themselves one day, right? Because this is sort of the vision of sort of everyone sharing in what God gives in common. So it was, you're quite right, like it was understood to be sort of communist, but it's not communist. Communism sort of opposes sort of private ownership of land, but this is something quite different. The whole idea of land reform is distributing land so that people can own it, not just the rich, but also the poor. Right?
Got it.
Yeah.
Interesting. It reminds me of John Rockefeller. How much land is enough? How much wealth is enough? Just a little bit more, as was his response.
Yeah.
Now, so the United States government began to get involved in United States foreign policy. I know Romero wrote a letter to President Carter. Can you outline for us a little bit what's happening with the United States involvement, Romero's response to that, and how that affected the people of El Salvador?
Yeah. So just to back up real quick, and there's
Please.
sort of long-standing U.S. commercial military involvement in Latin America. It goes way back. But so U.S. military assistance to El Salvador predates the Civil War, predates like Romero writing that letter to Jimmy Carter that you've referenced. And I think maybe like one place to begin is what's commonly referred to as the national security doctrine. And this is basically like U.S. led effort to train and equip Latin American militaries to fight communism, to your point earlier, Danny, about sort of this sort of communist frame through which everything's being viewed at this time. And the national security doctrine had like two main components. Like one component was military aid, to many countries in Latin America, billions in funding in weapons and logistical support, etc. But there's also like another important element to it, when that was counterinsurgency training, right? So training people to fight against guerrillas or revolutionaries, or potential guerrillas or revolutionaries, right? And this training includes tactics like disappearing people. I don't know if that term's particularly familiar. Your listeners, but this is a word that emerges at the time. People literally spoke of people being disappeared, or disappearances, right? Where people would just be taken in the middle of the night or during the day, and no one would hear from them again, right? But also torture, right? Assassination. And there's an important American base that's part of this sort of counterinsurgency training. It's called the School of the Americas. It was in the Panama Canal Zone, but then now today it's in Fort Benning in Georgia, right? And this is where sort of many sort of figures in Latin America, they went to the School of the Americas to learn this kind of training, including the people that killed Romero. So they're not only using weapons that the United States funded, or that are from the United States, but also training that they learned, right? The sniper that killed Romero probably had this kind of training. And so the violence during this time, right, was against communism. It was framed as a defense of the free world, American civilization, Western civilization. But part of the problem here, right, is that communism is incredibly, like Leslie Gill, she wrote this great book on the School of the Americas. She describes communism as an incredibly elastic category, right? So elastic, so stretchable that it could encompass any critic of the status quo. Romero, right? Who are not communist, who explicitly critique communism, but because they're labeled communists, they now sort of get tarred and associated with this. So this is sort of the background of Romero's sort of letter to Jimmy Carter. Interestingly, just one more point about this. This is a bipartisan U.S. endeavor, right? Not to get too political about it, but like, we were just talking about sort of the national security doctrine emerges out of JFK. Romero writes a letter to Carter, but this is also Nixon. It's then Reagan, right? This is Republican and Democratic administrations pursuing a very similar line of approach against communism within Central America.
I think that it seems to me, though, that the whole Cuban issue of the early 60s with the Bay of Pigs, and then with the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that, and Castro and the relationship there, it seems like that cast a psychological and strategic pall over everything that it's like there was this never-ending fear that Cuba would be repeated all across Latin America. And so everything to oppose that became justified. Am I right on that, you think?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm a theologian, but I read a lot of history, and most of the historians that I read would say that really there was no Soviet proxy presence within Latin America. I mean, not within Cuba, right? There was, Khrushchev sort of put the missile, the missile crisis. So there was a real sort of Soviet connection presence within Cuba, but beyond Cuba, there really wasn't. Yet there was this sort of way of seeing sort of struggles for any kind of justice societally as communist, and the intensity of the repression by governments, as well as the sort of the generosity of U.S. support for militaries and counterinsurgency training was because precisely, Danny, of this fear that you mentioned, that so the Soviet Union would sort of creep through Central America and Latin America, and these were places in our own backyard. So we had to draw the line, and we had to be especially brutal in beating it back. That seems to have been the logic.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but I was 8 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in our schools, we did all the crazy things that they taught us to go out in the hallway and put your head down and all the for anti-nuclear attack thing. Anyway, the level of fear around that was palpable, and so I think I do think that definitely affected psychologically, and you said strategically, my generation's understanding of that part of the world. And I agree with you that it's interesting for us to now, in hindsight, to note that presence, the communist presence, probably wasn't there in other parts, not in the same way, the Soviet presence anyway.
Yeah.
But it was so easy for that to be the framework because I think of what the early '60s were like, and particularly on that whole Soviet American and the Cuban. I grew up in that, so it just I remember the fear as a kid.
So.
Can I just
go ahead,
one
Matthew, if you want to
point
add
on that
something.
real quick? I mean, it's a super important point, and fear can lead you to do all the different sorts of things, right?
Exactly.
But like one thing that's really important in understanding Romero's context is, I would argue that, ironically, because of this fear and because of the sort of the repression aimed at eliminating the communist threat, ironically, it's as if it produced the very problem that it was struggling against.
Sure.
In other words, like, violence has a pedagogy, right?
Yes.
You get trained through sort of
That's
violence
so important.
to violence. And in the case of Romero's El Salvador, many people who argued for reform and went out into the streets peacefully, when they were met with such brutality, they then began to think, well, these folks don't respond to like persuasion and peaceful demonstration. They only respond to violence. That's the only way things are going to change. Yeah. And that then became essentially the FMLN and the kind of revolutionary movements that emerged. They became much more powerful, and many more people flooded into those movements as soon as they realized that peaceful protest was not viable anymore.
Oh,
we haven't learned that lesson even anymore, have we?
It just shows you again the almost seductive element or insidious element of what I'm calling empire, right? Because it produces, and then of course, once that violence happens on the part of the people in these rebel groups, then it justifies us going in and giving military support to help the government overcome these military. So go ahead, and this is wonderful framing. Thank you so much. Now help us understand exactly what's happening with why Romero's writing this letter to Jimmy Carter and the U.S.'s involvement, and how Romero thinks that this is problematic and undermining what he's trying to accomplish for the people of El Salvador.
Yeah, so basically what Romero does is he writes a public letter to Jimmy Carter urging him to stop military aid because, and I don't have the sort of the specifics of like how much money, it was millions of dollars that was being discussed in sort of Congress to be appropriated to support sort of Salvadoran security. And this was because of the fight against communism, right? And so essentially what Romero does is he writes Jimmy Carter directly, and he addresses him as a Christian, and he says, you may not understand what's happening. Let me tell you what's happening. What's happening is that this money that's coming in the name of fighting communism is really used for repression. It's really being used to repress people who are advocating for justice in El Salvador, who are hungry and want food to eat, who need access to land, who are being just indiscriminately killed by this administration. So you need to stop this, and you need to do what your administration has said it was going to do, which is condition aid of any kind on human rights and the respect for human rights. That's essentially what Romero says. And so in any case, I mean, one of the things that I think is just fascinating about the letter is it teaches us something really important about how Romero thought about being a Christian, that it was more determinative than our national identities, that Romero as a Salvadoran Christian could write Jimmy Carter as an American Christian, as Christians, and as if that could relativize our commitments to our nations respectively, right?
Well,
that he could read him and tell him the truth. He thought that appealing to Carter as a Christian could persuade him. I mean, it ended up not persuading him, the military aid was appropriated. It was sent, and the violence continued. Romero died. He was killed in 1980. And then it just continued, if not more, under the Reagan regime.
Yeah. This is a great segue to where we want to kind of land this plane before we run out of time here
Yeah,
today.
yeah.
And that is, at a time of many Western Christians, we struggle to understand the connection between the gospel and social justice. What do you think Óscar Romero could teach us about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think he thinks of the salvation that Christ brings as transforming people, and through people transforming the world and impacting the world, right? That the gospel for Romero it's about personal transformation and personal salvation, but that because we are social creatures, because we're embodied in the world in the ways that we are, that sort of salvific work that Christ and the Holy Spirit does in us necessarily has these sorts of ramifications outside of us and impact the world more broadly. There's a really important passage that Romero always cites in this regard. It's from a gathering of Latin American bishops in 1968 in Medellin, Colombia. And really important for sort of liberation theology more generally, at least the kind of currents that I was talking about earlier. And the bishops say we need a new Latin American continent, right? But we won't have a new continent without new people. And what they mean by new people is new people who are made part of Christ, incorporated into Christ through the waters of baptism and through faith in Christ, right? That's the novelty. And the vision is that when your life is transformed in this way, it will like bear fruit in the world, living like Christ does, caring for people in the way Christ does, feeding people, healing people, being in solidarity with people, right? And that this love of God and neighbor will be sort of transformative. It will be leaven in a society and reshape society. So that's the kind of vision. And for Romero, like this kind of vision of the gospel and the kind of work and care and love and justice that emerges from it, it's like not an add-on. It's like a natural expression of the Christian faith. And like it means living like Christ does, doing what Christ does, right? And so, I think that like what it can teach us is like a holistic gospel, a gospel that is not just individuated, but like, again, a gospel that like Jesus talks about, good news that bears fruit, like good trees that produce fruit, through their faith in Christ.
Wow. Well, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. And let me just remind our viewers and listeners that Determined Truth is a 501c3 nonprofit. Danny and I work with 100 pastors or more in India each week, training and equipping them. We're also doing everything we can to be a voice to the American church, the evangelical church, to challenging the church to be the church. We have podcasts, live streams, YouTube channel, blogs, and all kinds of other resources. So we want to encourage you to go to determinedtruth.com, which is on the bottom bar there, and go ahead and fill out the the contact us thing. That will get you on our email list. We'll send out an email monthly, but you know what we're doing, what we have going on. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, of course. That'll alert you to upcoming live streams, as we will continue to be having probably in the next couple of weeks a lot more of the conversations on Iran and Israel and what's going on there. But let me go ahead and finish this up today. Thank you very much, Matthew. This has been fantastic and really helpful for us as well. So if Óscar Romero were alive today, you may have touched on this a little bit already, but what do you think he would have to say to the American church, especially the Protestant evangelical church, or the larger American church as a whole, if you wish?
Yeah, I think he would have a lot to say. I mean, I think
I would hope so.
He'd be really confused about or concerned about the confusions and the distortions of the gospel. Christ lived, ministered, was executed under the Roman Empire, right? He was killed on a Roman cross, which was a tool of state violence. And so I think that he thinks that there's real risks of sort of distorting the gospel when empire is embraced. I mean, I think that like we haven't spoken a lot about migration, so I think that that's where I'd like to conclude.
Excellent.
Sure. Yeah.
One way of thinking about what Romero was about trying to realize the right of people not to migrate. He was advocating for conditions in El Salvador, access to land, better distribution of wealth and property, enabling Salvadorans to live in safety and security in their own country. What was the response? Well, the response, as we've talked quite a bit about, was brutal repression, a repression so fierce that it generated a civil war. It led people who had nothing to risk it all, picking up arms, fighting the government to a standstill. And what happened? Well, in 1980, when the Civil War began, Salvadorans who had previously only migrated, for the most part, internally and regionally, they started migrating to the United States.
Yeah.
Right. And new patterns of migration began to emerge that have only developed and intensified and complexified since that point. So in some ways, right, the story of sort of migration, the migration crisis we talk about today, that we only think about in relationship to criminality and crossing borders, has this much deeper, complicated history that's part of the very thing we're talking about today, right? And so I think that he would see the ways in which we are responding to the migrants among us as not only myopic, sort of like lacking sense of history, but also cruel and not inspired by the gospel.
Would you, I think I hear you saying this, and I think Danny and I have addressed this on other live streams, and I've addressed this in some of my blogs as well, and that is that it's American foreign policy that has, in these Central American and South American countries, that has actually driven the migrants from their homes to come to our borders or to come into the United States. We drove them here because of things that we did. Because one of the things that we added to that was people don't want to leave their homes. They don't want to leave their families. They don't want to leave everything that they've ever known for generations and generations. Something caused them to come here. Is that what I hear you saying?
I think people come for many reasons, but that's one important part of the story. There's a fantastic book about this. I don't know if you all can see it. I guess
your screen's blurred. What's the title?
My screen is blurred. It's called Harvest of Empire by Juan Gonzalez, A History of Latinos in America. And it was written sort of 10, 15 years ago, but it's very much about this. It's an argument about the U.S. presence in Latin America and the impact of that presence. The migration of people to the United States is the harvest of empire, right? Very much, in line with your thinking about empire. I think it's essential reading for thinking through this question. Again, I think it's complicated because in the history of the United States, like those we call Mexicans were on U.S. soil prior to the U.S. even existing. So the story is a little bit more complicated, but certainly what we've been talking about today is a big part of the reason why so many people have come over the years.
Wow. It's a great resource.
Wow.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Anything else you want to add before we sign off? This has been fantastic.
I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Really appreciate you guys having me on.
Well, I really appreciate you
it's been very helpful.
Helping enlighten. Excuse me. Take over, Danny.
No, I was going to say, we need a whole nother discussion about the current state of El Salvador in relation to the United States. There's a whole new thing going on there, but that's a different question for a different time. But this has been fascinating. I've had a little bit of other exposure to Central America. I spent some time in the Shield Triangle in Guatemala with a while back, and I worked with the International Justice Mission for a while. I have a lot of work in the Northern Triangle countries on anti-human trafficking stuff, and got into some of the poverty issues there. So this is an area of the world that is always sort of fascinated me, and I appreciate your insight. It's been really, really helpful.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rob, please.
I was going to say, well, your comments on immigration were spot on and very, very helpful and very relevant to the present moment also.
Yeah. And I would just finally, I mean, Danny, you spoke about the whole new thing going on in El Salvador right now. It's really connected to the old things. It's connected.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Yeah.
Too, right. And so that the present is deeply implicated with the past as we know it. So, yeah.
Well, we will get to reading The Harvest of Empire, and maybe we'll come back to you or connect with you or some of your colleagues as well.
Fascinating stuff.
We know you have some boxes to pack and some things to do.
Yeah.
But we appreciate so much your time. Thank you so much. If you've been listening, we appreciate you following us. Make sure you like and subscribe this channel, share it with others, and let us know what we're doing. So thank you so much.
Take care.